decisions, for example. And we'll have some talks here on these issues. This is not just agent-based modeling. Yes, we will have some agent-based modeling, but we also have some other types of modeling as well. We encourage lots of different types of experimentation with different types of models. So we did have 7 talks planned, but unfortunately one of our speakers is not able to be here, and that's the first on the list, Ankita. So Ankita's not able to be here, so what I'm going to do, and she's not able to present online, so rather than, we've got her slides and we can share those. I'm just going to really quickly read out her abstract so that you can be aware of what she was going to talk about, and so you can follow up with her if you're interested. So Ankita was going to speak on modeling the behavior of global land managers in alternative futures. I'll skip the first few sentences. Essentially, she was going to present Crafty Global, an agent-based global land system model which operates at a 0.16 degree spatial resolution based on a broad range of land system data. Crafty Global aims to explore future land use decision-making under varied climatic and socio-economic conditions and can provide broad contextual information, particularly concerning the interactions among land use sectors and the land managers within them. So if you're interested in that really big, large-scale agent-based modeling, then please seek Ankita's work out. We've got everybody else here. The idea here was to start global and finish local. So we'll see if that comes out. We should have a little bit of time, if I stop rambling at the end, for a bit of plenary discussion. But initially we thought that we wouldn't have time for that, and so we've planned immediately after this session in the coffee break a continuation for discussion if we want to, over coffee. I am not 100% sure where we're going to be standing, but we can all move together as a group if we want to continue out there. And maybe there we can, as well as continuing discussion from this session, we can also talk about the working group itself and what we want to do with that if you have ideas and want to get more involved. So I will stop there, and we'll hand over to our first speaker. So if we could get the slides for the first speaker. Hi guys. If we can get the slides for the first speaker, and I'll hand over to Vieira.
Great. Hi, everyone. My name's Vieira. I'm a PhD student at King's College London, and I also work for an NGO called CDP that engages with financial institutions and companies on various environmental issues, deforestation included among them. Gracias. Great, so today I'll be explaining in some detail how we went about modeling the behaviors of agri-food companies and their investors, specifically as it relates to their strategies around deforestation and forest fires. Where do I click? Oh, great. So I will briefly cover the problem my research focuses on and the aim of my research, but the bulk of the presentation will focus on modeling the interactions between financial institutions and companies and how we did that using a fuzzy cognitive agent-based model. And then at the end, I'll briefly touch upon how we integrated this fuzzy agent model with a producer-level model to model the interactions between all the stakeholders, financial institutions, companies, and producers, as well as the environmental impacts. Great, so to the problem. So as you are probably aware, our shifting consumption patterns and growing meat consumption and consumption of processed foods is driving really extensive land use change, specifically for the large-scale production of key commodities such as soybeans, palm oil. That's driving not only deforestation, but frequency of forest fires, rising global temperatures, changes in precipitation patterns, and loss of biodiversity. My research aims to improve our understanding of how financial institutions and companies involved in this food system influence the deforestation and forest fires through the strategies that they take. So why financial institutions and companies? Well, the commodity supply chains can be represented in this manner, where you have producers on one end and us, the consumers, on the other, and the commodities flow through the supply chains, through these various companies and get processed and manufactured into products and retailed to us. Actually, this supply chain is more hourglass shaped, where you've got many producers on one end, very few traders in the middle who exert great influence over the supply chain, more manufacturers and retailers on the other end, and financial institutions with their influence into all of these stakeholders through the investments that they have in them. Not quite sure why. So over the years, these stakeholders made various pledges and commitments to tackle deforestation from the commodity production and address deforestation and fire use. However, deforestation and fire use continues, so our theory of change and our mental model of this system is really thrown into doubt, because we assumed that these strategies, or deforestation-free and fire-free strategies, would flow throughout this commodity supply chain down to the producer level, but doesn't seem to be the case. So the aim was to improve our understanding of how these strategies flow through the system, and a fuzzy cognitive agent-based model was designed for this. So to improve our understanding of what influences companies to change, to be more environmentally, and the role of divestment within this, fuzzy cognitive maps were used, and they're basically graphical representation of cause and effect and the relationships between the concepts in the system. And the great thing about them is that they're semi-quantitative, so you can take them and integrate them into models, and you can put numbers to soft social concepts that are really difficult to empirically measure. So first I identified the concepts and the relationships from literature. Then I surveyed investors and company representatives to verify these concepts and add the weights to the arrows that link these concepts. And the participants could also suggest new concepts and new relationships, or say certain relationships didn't exist. I aggregated all the survey responses into what's called a social fuzzy cognitive map, or a mental model of how the system operates, and then integrated it into ABM. So here you can see some of the results from the survey. So this is the company representatives highlighting what influences them to improve their environmental performance. And you can see top of the list is market demand for products with high environmental quality. This is what the end result of aggregating all the survey responses looks like, the social fuzzy cognitive map of the system. And you can see that some of the concepts are unique to the companies and others to the financial institutions, whereas some of them are shared as well. So there's two ways to go about integrating fuzzy cognitive maps into ABM, and that's by using the fuzzy cognitive maps as the mental models for the agents, so they use that in their decision making, or by using agents within one of the concepts to extend its value and then inform the rest of the fuzzy cognitive map. In my model, which is depicted on the right, of the financial institutions and the traders and buyers, fuzzy cognitive mapping was used in both of these ways. So the fuzzy cognitive maps were the mental models of the agents, and they use that for their decision making. But then also results from groups of these agents informed the other fuzzy cognitive maps of the other agents. So we use this model to examine under what conditions companies improve their environmental quality, so adopt more deforestation fire-free strategies, and what role financial institutions play in this under various environmental and economic scenarios using the RCP-SSP pathways. And you can see a figure of one of the results for RCP 4.5, whereby each of the rows is a different SSP. Along the top, you've got varying degrees of capital availability, so that's how much money the company has to change, going from low to high. Along the y-axis, you have the amount of fire-free financial institutions. Along the x-axis, you've got the amount of deforestation-free financial institutions. And you can see that clear thresholds emerge, at which point all companies swap to being deforestation fire-free. So that's going from grey to pink. But depending on what SSP-RCP pathway it is, you can see different conditions are required. So some require higher levels of capital availability, such as SSP5. But some need additional measures, such as SSP3. And you can see results for SSP3 there, with certain concepts adjusted. And we found that 3 concepts play a really important role in the full-scale adoption of sustainable practices in these tricky scenarios, such as SSP3, and that's financial performance of the company, the reputation of the company, and the environmental performance of the company. And you can see that when the financial performance of the company is impacted on the left, there's lots of adoption of more sustainable practices because there's lots of divestment happening in the system. But even if a company is not being penalized for not being green or more sustainable, and they're profiting off of that, you can see that we can see change in the system if their reputational and their environmental performance is impacted. So what we need is lots of negative media press coverage, lots of really rigorous ESG ratings of the companies, and then we can see change even though they're profiting off of unsustainable practices. You can also see that we need less of those things if the company has more capital to change. So finally, how we went about integrating this fuzzy cognitive agent-based model into with a producer level model, and that's depicted in this conceptual framework where you can see the fuzzy cognitive agent-based model of financial institutions in the blue box on the top, and the producer level in green, and they're joined together through the traders. And below you can see that the strategies flow from the financial institutions and the buyers through the traders down to the producer level, who use that in their decision making, along with their ability and their willingness to decide how and what commodities they're going to produce. That then flows back through the traders up to the financial institutions, together with environmental information, such as how much deforestation occurred in the system, how much fire use was used, and some financial information on how well the companies are doing. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions now or later, and also happy to hear any feedback on our approach and on the conceptual model itself. Thank you.
Excellent. So well done for keeping to time, Vieira. Any quick clarifying questions on what Vieira was up to? Yes.
Thanks very much. That was great. How will you take this forward in the future? Once you get beyond the modelling, can you do some empiricals to see if that tracks what the model tells you?
That's I'd love to. So, yeah, it's quite difficult to find the data sets that would enable us to kind of replicate real world deforestation rates and kind of attribute that to the influence that financial institutions and companies are having. But yeah, we could try, but yeah, there's quite limited data to allow us to do that. What it's more useful as I see, or and I don't know if James agrees, but is potentially using it as a game. So you would go and engage the stakeholders and try and get them to, give us more data on how they believe the system operates, and what's influential, but also to give them the outcomes of their decisions, right? So they could see that if they don't divest, then there's not enough companies, producers aren't engaged, or if they don't give the financial incentives to the producers, then they won't change, and we continue in this loop of further deforestation and fire use. So rather than replicating deforestation rates and possibly predicting scenarios, outcomes for scenarios, I see it more useful as an engagement tool to kind of get that change in the system that we need.
Yes, and to follow up very quickly, Vera had a really hard time just talking to financial institutions in the first place. They're private companies who don't actually really want to share what they're doing. So going back and engaging them with this might, hopefully they'll be willing to do that, but quite challenged to actually talk to them about their strategies. Yeah. Okay, next up, Yue.
Thank you. I hope I can manage this. Good afternoon, everyone. This is my very first time attending a conference in person since 5 years ago. So last time I attended was GLP 2019 I think in Switzerland. So I hope my in-person presentation skills are not so rusty and I can convey what I want to convey today to you. So a big professor at Natural Resource Department at Faculty of ITC, Earth Observation and Geospatial Science, University of Twente in the Netherlands. I am here on behalf of my co-authors to present a bit of effects of crop value chains on land use change. So when we talk about agricultural land use, we have to consider food system approach, where we already talked a bit about. Agricultural land use, agricultural production is only the very first step. After that, you have a long chain of activities that before food can reach to the final consumption, to the final utilization, including distribution, aggregation, processing, marketing, etc., etc. So we did a systematic review a few years back with the PhD student and the committee. What we found, so we reviewed all simulation models that look at food security governance measures. And we followed the PRISMA flow, reviewed 110 studies. We found that the field is rich, so there are a lot of different modeling types have been used to understand food security. Most of them are agricultural land use change. However, we did find several significant gaps. For example, as you can see from the figure here, most of the studies look at production, trade, or consumption. So very few examples look at the activities in between of this production and consumption. And even fewer models considered the whole chain, represent the whole value chain. So despite the complexity of modern food systems, in models, in our simulation work, we rarely represent this missing middle. And what makes studying agricultural land use even more complicated nowadays is, besides the value chain, also most of the productions supplying demand that is far away. So 72 to 89% of the global population need food supply from 100 kilometers away. This is in this paper at the corner. So I use a few examples in this paper. Temperate cereal, rice and maize. So for temperate cereal, let me see if I can. For 50% global population, they can get their supply from 900 kilometers. But the rest of the 50% of the global population, on an average distance, they need to be supplied more than 5,200 kilometers away. Same story for rice. 50% of global population receive their rice within 650 kilometers, and the remaining receive rice for larger or further than 2,700 kilometers. And there's also huge regional differences, especially in Africa. So considering all this complexity in value chain and also physical distance, how can we represent sometimes or most times distantly connected value chains in land use change models? There have been great work done in recent years. For example, in the 2 papers Shiga Malek published, they used the left side framework, including ability, motivation, and underlying drivers to understand how farmers make decisions at a global scale. So they come up with maps, global maps. So they developed global distribution maps of 6 types of land use decision making. Here I will not go through all of them. This one is the example of market-oriented smallholders. As you can see that market-oriented smallholders are prevalent in Africa, China, India, a little bit in Latin America. So then you get this global distribution of how farmers make decisions. But as we discussed earlier, it's not enough, right? Farmers, they are the very first actors. They are the very first activity in food system. So move beyond farmers. A recent work is about to discuss a shift in agency in value chain actors. That paper specifically talk about land degradation, where they discussed how value chain actors and government state actors could motivate or punish producers in terms of land degradation activities. So this is great. These are all great progress. But a few questions still remain unanswered. In food system, what about the consumers? Can we as consumers at the end of the food chain change how land use will happen in a way or another? And what is the impact of distance between production and final consumptions on land use change? I'm sure all of you may have an idea of, okay, maybe I eat local, so this is sustainable. But from systematic review, or from systematic manner, we don't have this answer. And what is the impact of different types of value chain connections on land use change? So to answer all these questions, we did another systematic review. So here also, I would like to share what we have done so far, and I'd like to get some comments and discussion on how we can improve this analysis. So some of these results are not preliminary, but it's only part of what we have. So in total, we collected 198 articles, resulted in 531 unique cases, and we coded 6 types of land use change. It's not just land cover change, that is expansion or deforestation. We also focus on management or intensification or intensity change that include switch to different crops, crop diversification, environmental friendly practices, and also no change in practice. And value chain connection is very massive, and it's very difficult to classify, but we tried to classify them based on producers' distance to value chain, degree of value chain integration, point of the closest value chain contact, and physical distance to consumers, as well as if there is environmental standard present or not. So, give you some results, part of the results, the summary of value chain connections. So these are the different types we found in the 531 cases. So you can see that most are close to value chain, and for the degree of value chain integration, a large part of it is contract, but then also the other type, which including selling in spot market or in their own farm shop. Closest value chain contact, short is no other value chain or only one intermediate, and the rest is in longer chain, including cooperative, middleman, or wholesale, that is the integrated value chain. And distance to consumers, it's very rough, local, regional, global, but it gives you an idea. So you can see that local and global have a bit more ratio in the cases we found. And the environmental standard, not many cases reported this, but if they do, it's mostly yes. So for the analysis, we try to because the database doesn't really allow us to do any quantitative analysis, so we could only use co-occurrence pattern or pattern recognition. So the first hypothesis is shorter value chain is more frequently observed with environmental friendly practice, which from the number of cases, the patterns, you can see, yes, we support this hypothesis. When the chain is shorter, indeed, it's more likely that you will see environmental friendly practice. And longer physical distance between production and final consumption is more likely to cause expansion or deforestation. That is more unsustainable. So we use global distance as reference, and indeed you can see that crop diversification or intensification, this is sort of more on the other side of expansion or deforestation, is more likely to happen in local physical distance. But with expansion and switch to different crops, it's more likely, it's less likely to find in the local. So these are some results, and this is the framework that Neil used. This is a bit messy, so that's why it's not in the manuscript, but I think it's a first step to include consumers or the whole value chain, the integration in this type of thinking. How can we represent the whole chain including consumers, including physical distance, as well as the integration of value chain in land use modeling. So because of time, we can look at it later if you don't mind the messiness. But for discussion, I think for physical distance, for example, there are many discussion points, many things I can still explore. But for physical distance between production and consumption, it is important. For example, telecoupling has been around more than 10 years now to understand deforestation, but the value chain dynamics also contribute. This is also in line with all the work has been done in Brazil, Amazon, when they talk about soya and beef, the stickiness of value chain actors. And also what we found a big gap is you see mostly local and global reports, but there's not so much reporting on the neighboring countries or the neighboring regions. What is the value chain and what is the consumption and land use change behaviors. And for value chain integration, it is true that it's less incentives for producers in longer value chain. It doesn't matter about the physical distance, but as long as the chain is long, then it becomes more difficult for their efforts to be seen by the end consumers. So the last point is, how can we use this type of systematic view to inform our land use change models? Should we do a global value chain likelihood map, like the smallholder decision making? Or should we do a value chain typology so the first is very useful to inform models like Clumondo? Or should we do a value chain typology that can be used by agent-based model, including Crafty? So these are some discussion points. I'd like to hear your thoughts later. And the paper is forthcoming, well, I can confidently say, because now we are just editing the line number X, you need to change this word. So I think it'll be coming out soon. So if you are interested, please follow up. And these are all the references I mentioned in the presentation. Thank you.
Excellent, thanks, Yue. Some big questions. We'll get into discussion later. Maybe any very quick clarifying questions about techniques or what was done? Okay, we can come back to these big questions later. So, next talk, I think, is you, Casey. Yeah.
I'm going to keep my computer here so that I don't ramble off what I want to say. Great, thanks. Okay, so I'm talking today about modeling system dynamics in the context of trying to promote greater participatory both model design and policy design. So this is some work that both myself and Ol Perkins here have been doing in collaboration with the UK government. I have asked, please don't take photos because it is in collaboration with government. Okay, so just to give a little bit of context on current approaches to UK land policy. In light of the Net Zero strategy and the recent Environment Act that has come out in the UK, we have various different really challenging commitments that we need to meet. I won't go through them here. These are just a few examples of trying to maintain self-sufficiency in food production, increasing our woodland and new habitats for biodiversity, each by about 1 million acres, increasing our national parks and areas of outstanding natural beauty from 27% to 30%, which equates to about 1.8 million acres, as well as building 300,000 new homes each and every year until 2050. Considering the size of the UK, this is an enormous ask. So how do we go about it? So there have been a couple of recent publications from the Committee for Climate Change and the Royal Society on trying to establish what some of the principles of that land use change are. And this was put forward in 2020 by Baroness Young to the House of Commons, that there was a real need for a UK land use framework to set the scene. That was supposed to be published in 2023. We have yet to see a sign of it. We'll see what comes out in the next year or so. Is it that way? So what are the current approaches? So currently, the way in which UK government is tackling land use change through the modelling perspective is mainly through these two approaches. So through integrated assessment models and through agent-based models. And underpinning, certainly in the way that they are currently used in government, the underpinnings of those are very much driven by kind of classical economic approaches with economic optimization, profit maximization. The two main models that we see in use are ERAMP and NEVO, both of which actually do quite a good job at integrating those kind of economic optimization approaches with a kind of broader assessment of other factors such as sort of natural capital or sort of non-market based products of the landscape. But underpinning this is a real kind of lack of representation of the behavioural components that are involved in the kind of extensive land use changes that are required to meet our targets. So this was one of the quotes that came out of the Royal Society publication, saying, "It is of course a simplification to assume that all agents making decisions about land use are profit maximizers." So this is some work that we did kind of using multiple stakeholder input to try and understand the UK land system. So this was just some basic qualitative systems mapping that we did. And many of these aspects are kind of, you can quantify to some extent. The area where it gets really difficult is in these behavioural constraints. So this is work that has been extended quite significantly since, but this is kind of an overview of the broad system. So things like aging farmers without succession plans, a willingness to make change, new entrants into the system, the availability of knowledge and skills. These were components that were really hard to kind of get a grip on quantitatively. And one of the things that we've been trying to do is to develop these approaches into more of a quantitative tool for policy decision making. So what we did was we undertook a survey. We surveyed about 600 English farmers to try and understand what their appetites really were for future land use change, rather than looking at perhaps what their current practices were, but what the scope was for that change that was needed. And looking at kind of the empirical data out of that, so we were able to then use some of those estimates to parameterize components of our model. This is a decision tree approach used where we built two trees looking at two particular aspects. So one was looking at their willingness to undertake any amount of land use change, and the second was how much of their land they would be willing to actually diversify. And what was really interesting that came out of this was a bifurcation in our land use actors. So particularly between our low profit margin, more marginal farmers, so they tend to be more of our upland beef farmers, and our large scale, high profit margin arable farmers. And this kind of makes sense when you think about it in terms of those that have the least options available to them economically are more susceptible to selling up their land, particularly for carbon offsetting, versus those that have the economic capital to diversify. So from this, we were able to build in our behavioural submodel to the system dynamics model, looking at non-economic drivers of farmer decision-making, behavioural lags, and also beliefs about kind of viability and future prospects in carbon credit markets. So evaluating the model, so we've taken the last 30 years of different aspects on land area change and trade balance. So if we look at land area change on the left-hand side, overall we get a really quite good fit to the historical data, so about a 0.77, I think, R-squared value on that. And then on the trade balance, equally, we get a really good fit, about 0.7. And we can see this is for different aspects of our land use, so for biomass, cereals, dairy, farm trees, forest, meat and veg, and for our main commodity exports and imports. What we then can do is, once we have an idea of how the model is working in regards to representing the historical and current system, we can then use that as a basis to start projecting forward under different assumptions. So this is a very, very simplified version of some of the scenarios that we've been developing with government, and the fundamental sort of axes that we've been working on are the economic system, so between a more green economic form of growth versus a more traditional economic form of growth, and then the governance structure on the horizontal axis, so between more of a top-down versus a bottom-up approach. And what's quite interesting is that the preference for these scenarios differs according to the level, particularly within the polycentric sort of governance structure that we have in the UK, or that we're trying to work towards. We see different preferences. So particularly our A1 scenario, where we have top-down traditional economic growth, is the preferred scenario for our high-level national sort of decision makers. Our B2 bottom-up green economic is the preferred scenario of kind of mid-level, both national and regional decision makers. And then B1 was our preferred scenario. Sorry, B2 is more for our civil society, mainly the farmers, essentially. And B1 was our preferred scenario for our mid-level regional decision makers. So these are some of the results from the scenarios. So these are some of our net zero commitments to 2050. And what we see from this is that peatland restoration hits the target in all of our scenarios. I'll come back to that in a moment. Farm woodland doesn't hit any of our scenarios, any of our A scenarios. So A1, A2 doesn't get to our targets on farm woodland, whereas it does in our B scenarios. What's really interesting out of this, that biomass, and there are different sort of estimations on how much biomass is needed, or how much current thinking on biomass is needed. The only scenario that only just gets to any of the lowest estimate on those scenarios is our A1. And again, I'll come back to that in a moment. But in order to think a little bit more broadly about what some of the wider kind of trade-offs are when we think about land use change at the national level, we can then look at what it does to our trade balance. So all of our scenarios result in a significant improvement in carbon sequestration, but they all come at different costs. So what we can see is that the net carbon balance is significantly higher in the B scenarios than it is in the A scenarios. And that is fundamentally because all of the scenarios, except for our B1, lead to an increase in our offshore emissions. And that is fundamentally down to the fact that we do have a finite amount of land, and the demands that are on our land are simply too high to achieve the kind of changes that are currently in place, unless we're willing to trade that off with significant offshoring. We can then look at what is driving that. So what are the parameters driving those changes? And what we see from this is that fundamentally at the root of afforestation or farm woodland creation is behavioural constraints. And what was interesting was we followed this up with some participatory workshops. And this is something that really came out from that as well, is that ultimately farmers see themselves in the UK as food producers, not as foresters, and that is a key constraint, particularly in the uplands, on what kind of land use change they're willing to undertake. Whereas for biomass, we can see that it's the economics that really drive it. So that top row there, the economic kind of constraints are really driving biomass uptake. One of the other factors that drives farm woodland actually is logistics, and the interesting node within our system that does that is availability of nursery stocks. So those kind of core bottlenecks that you can get in the system that really need to be addressed before we start to implement the kind of policies to drive that change. Okay, so just concluding, so what we found in the survey was this bifurcation in actors. We found that this was followed up really nicely, that we had this really good sort of, I suppose, correspondence between our modelling results and our workshops. And that was quite heartwarming in the sense of knowing that we were sort of representing the system in a way that had significance in the real world. We see barriers to afforestation on farms are primarily behavioural, whereas bioenergy uptake is economically constrained. Ironically, one of the things we see in the behavioural time lags is that the farmers' behavioural lags in taking up kind of carbon dioxide removal strategies is actually good for the environment because they mitigate that offshoring. Our bioenergy targets are only just achieved, and that's because what's required to get there is really large-scale vertical bioenergy production, so a real reshaping of the energy system within the UK, but also that it requires massive subsidies, and that's largely because of the way that carbon pricing is factored into the model in going to bioenergy firms rather than going to the producers, and that sort of pass-through effect that you get is really quite small. And the fact that we found really good parallels between our model and our deliberative workshops. And I'm up. Amazingly got to time. Thank you.
Great. Any clarifying questions there? Lots of interesting stuff. Yes, one at the back here. Behind you, yeah.
Hi.
Thanks.
In your system map, it looked like all of the environmental stuff was just coming off woodland creation. So when you were talking about, rather than kind of silver pasture or any alternative agricultural practices, and if so, how come? Do we just not have the data for the kind of mixed land use?
Yeah, so it's a big gap at the moment in terms of how I mean, this again is government approach currently, so not necessarily that I'm suggesting that they shouldn't be integrated, but yeah, at the moment, agropastoral systems or silver arable systems are not part of our woodland targets. They are separate, so that is a case of afforestation off of agricultural land. So the amount of land take that we're looking at is quite significant. And this is why those kind of multifunctional landscapes, so when we look at agroforestry, are really central to achieving the kind of environmental consequences that we want to get out of land use change, that it's only going to come through those kind of multifunctional practices, because that kind of land sparing versus land sharing argument just doesn't work in terms of an equitable outcome. Thanks.
Thanks, Katie. Okay, next up, we have Eamon. Over to you.
Hi, I'll be presenting on Egyptian agriculture in 2100. My name's Eamon, and I'm a PhD student at the University of Edinburgh. This work was done with the support of my supervisors, Calum, Mark, and Peter. So I'll go through a bit of a context, the objectives, scenario development, downscaled scenarios for the Egyptian context, the model development, and some further work. When I submitted the abstract, I was hoping to have some results to share. Unfortunately, due to some challenges, that's not been possible, but I hope you find the scenarios and the model development interesting. Whenever I do a presentation, I like to include the satellite image of Egypt. I think it tells a lot about the Egyptian context. It's a country of about 1 million square kilometers, of which little above 6% houses all of the population, agricultural area. And it tells a lot of Egypt's kind of prosperous history and challenges of the present, but potentially opportunities for the future. So in terms of the introduction, Egypt's population has increased rapidly since the 1950s. It's gone from 20 million in 1950 to about 100 million in 2019. This five-fold increase has been met with a stagnant renewable water resource. In the 50s, Egypt and Sudan divided the water arriving into the south of Egypt and North Sudan when the Aswan Dam was being built. And it was agreed that Egypt would have 55 billion cubic meters, and it's had that quota since then. But as a result, because the population has increased so much, the per capita quota has reduced dramatically. 1,000 meters cubed per capita is what's required for water security, and currently it's below 590. Climate change is likely to make this significantly worse. Crop water demand is likely to increase dramatically in the future, in the coming decades. It's already seeing summers of very high temperatures for extended periods of time. And extreme weather conditions are likely to increase both in severity and frequency. Finally, sea level rises are also likely to inundate some of the most profitable areas in the Delta region, as well as cause salination of some of the most important groundwater aquifers. In terms of previous research, there has been attempts to do scenario analyses for Egypt. However, these tend to focus on crop water demand and doesn't look at actual crop water use. It doesn't consider farmer decision-making, technology diffusion, or spatially distributed hydrological modeling. So with that in mind, the aim is to understand how Egyptian farmers will adapt to rapidly developing challenges and what opportunities can be leveraged to maximize production. And the objectives are to develop downscale scenarios, develop a model, and then see how land managers respond to these scenarios and the impact of their decisions on both production and water use. So this is a summary of the scenarios. They're based on the SSP RCPs. We tried to kind of find the aspects that are most important, the things that will impact farmer decision making, the aspects that will impact crop production. So population economic growth, for example, will impact demand. They will impact access to finances, access to human resource, the agricultural labor force, etc. And we see as a developing country, both of those are expected to increase under all scenarios. The extent of increase varies. More fossil-fueled future is likely to see a more dramatic increase compared to, say, regional rivalries. Education and healthcare, investment and development in those areas are also likely to increase in most scenarios. But we kind of suspect maybe in some scenarios a small reduction. Social cohesion, maybe as a measure of exchange of knowledge and technology diffusion, is likely to increase in scenarios 1 to 3, but less so in scenarios 4 and 5. Water use efficiency, both technology development and diffusion, we see as increasing in the first 3 scenarios but reducing in the last 2. Egypt has, as many developing countries, tried to grow cash crops for the export market. And the focus on this impacts how much land is used for domestic production. So this being prioritized in different scenarios will impact, potentially subsidies in different areas and for different crops. So we anticipate that export focus is likely to increase in SP5 and potentially reduce in SP3, unchanged in SSP1. Finally, non-hydrological renewable energy and regional cohesion. These 2 aspects impact the management of the Aswan Dam, and this is kind of the most important boundary for water in Egypt. Egypt depends on the Aswan Dam not just for water but for electricity. If there are alternative electricity sources, it could be that the dam is managed more to ensure agricultural production as opposed to electricity production. And obviously there are tensions with other riparian countries. If there's more social cohesion, regional cohesion and cooperation, it could be that drought periods could be managed on a regional level The first model is the eco-hydrological model, so this model is a SWOT+. The key components here are the groundwater submodel, the surface water submodel, and the vegetation submodel. So and then the main inputs are the meteorological conditions and land use, and then user-defined irrigation application and management practices. So this kind of shows a map of the area of interest. I intend to do a national level model, but because it's an arid environment, there's no need to include the whole area. Rainfall is quite low. It's unlikely to impact the hydrological system. This area is about 30% of the total area, but about 95% of the crops area. The key boundary is AS1 here in red. And this model will be used initially to create the natural capital for the agent-based model, or the potential crop growth in each grid cell for each crop type. The next model is the agent-based model, or CRAFT-E, competition for resources between agent functional types. And the key components here are the capitals, the land managers, and the ecosystem services. Unlike other CRAFT-E models, this is focused on crop production. And the capitals represent the resources. The land managers, the key aspects of a land manager is the decisions they make. So the key decisions will be what crops they grow, what technology they use, and then their characteristics. How likely are they to give up or give in after a competition for resources? And demand is defined exogenously to the model. So the key inputs are the capitals. So here I've tried to represent some of the data sources for each of the capital. These are the non-natural capitals. For human capital, at the top we've got the gridded data sets, and below are the subnational data sets. For human capital, we have subnational education and health index, and that's downscaled using gridded population data. For social capital, there's a Gini index and cooperative membership data set. For financial, it's gridded GDP per capita. And finally, for manufactured, it's tractor per unit area and the road network or road density data on a subnational level. The agent functional types are defined on two aspects. The first is the cropping patterns. So because of Egypt's climate and access to water, there are up to 3 seasons, but 2 seasons are the most important, winter and summer. The Nile season tends to be quite short and tends to be a relatively small area. There are many crops, but we decided to focus on 14, or crops and crop groupings, 14 seasonal and 3 perennial. In terms of behavior types, this was defined based on a typology analysis that we conducted earlier this year of a labor market panel survey. And this diagram is trying to show the transition between the 2 dates in the labor market panel survey in 2012 and 2018. And the key types that were identified were specialized, village, diversified, and landlord. Landlord agent types tend to own land but don't produce anything, so weren't considered relevant. And diversified is similar to village but tend to have alternative incomes adjacent to their agricultural income. We estimated that about 10% in 2010 are specialized and 90% are village, and initially we've kind of attributed some characteristics to them. The specialized tend to use more efficient water, tend to have more efficient water use, so tend to use technology such as drip irrigation or sprinkler systems, whereas village tend to have lower give-in, give-up thresholds. This isn't from the typology analysis, but is more based on anecdotal kind of understanding of traditional farmers maybe having greater inertia in terms of change and land being important, kind of cultural capital. And this is a paper, if anybody's interested in reading that in more detail. In terms of the model coupling, so each time step, Crafty, there is a competition between different agents in Crafty. At the end of that, there's a map of the agent types, a gridded map, that is taken into SWOT Plus, and the agents represent both land use and technology type. And then on a daily basis, SWOT Plus calculates water use and crop production. And then that is fed into, summed and fed into Crafty for the next year. In terms of further work, model coupling still hasn't been completed. There's a need to kind of fine-tune the AFT parameters once that coupling takes place. And the hope is that potentially there could be more complex management practices could be included. SWOT Plus is a very versatile hydrological model with a lot of options for management practice. But this may increase the AFTs or complicate the coupling process. And that's yet to be seen. Thank you very much for listening.
Any quick, if no one else has? One over here? Yeah, go for it.
Thanks. Since nobody asked, what about this GRD dam that the Ethiopians are building? Would they anyhow change your model, the calibration of it at least? I don't know.
I think I've read quite a few papers. This is like a very popular topic when it comes to Nile, research to do with the Nile. I think what I've seen is mostly the possible issue could be during the filling process and potential drought periods. I think the risk is relatively limited. It could impact, but probably not during calibration. I think it impacts the sort of scenarios that we decide to look at. For our model, we've decided to set the boundary at the outlet of Aswan Dam, but it would be possible to bring that back and do it at the flow into Egypt, and then consider different kind of flow scenarios. It's not conclusive what it's going to look like in the future. Some papers say that if there was an extended drought period, obviously then there's, Ethiopia has to decide how much it releases. But in most scenarios, you're seeing either stable or a slight increase in water landing in the Nile basin. So yeah, thank you.
Great, thanks, Eamon. Okay, next up we have Alder.
Yes, hello everyone. My name is Alder. Today I'm going to be presenting also on behalf of my colleague Milagros. We are both from Nicaragua. We are PhD researchers at the Institute of Development Policy of the University of Antwerp. And today I'm going to try to introduce you to our research, which basically has to do with modeling local processes of agricultural change in cattle-oriented regions using agent-based modeling. I want to start my presentation by showing you this map. What you see here is Bozaguas. It is the biggest biosphere reserve in Central America. It is located in the northeast region of Nicaragua, and it covers an area of nearly 2,000 square kilometers. It is comprised by a big buffer zone that you can see in green light color here, and 6 core areas. Now, according to data from the European Commission Joint Research Center, this is the extent of the tropical moist forest covered in Bozaguas in 1990. And this is what remains of the forest in 2023. All the areas that you see here in orange are areas that has already been deforested. That's why we have entitled our presentation The Withering Frontier, or La Frontera Marchita in Spanish. So a fundamental question here is what is causing this pattern of tropical deforestation? Well, there are many possible explanations. Next week, we are going to publish an article on the role of the state in this pattern, but today I'm going to talk about one of the most well-established explanations for this pattern that is called the hamburger connection hypothesis. Basically, this hypothesis holds that the deforestation is caused by the expansion of cattle raising, and this expansion of cattle raising is fueled by the international demand for cheap meat. A very important feature of this hypothesis is that cattle ranchers themselves do not directly engage into tropical deforestation. Rather, they indirectly contribute to deforestation by absorbing small family farms who then tend to migrate to the forest margins, where they implement greedy forest routine to establish new farms looking for better livelihoods or better opportunities. However, we want to explore a new idea, that is that although cattle raising plays a key role in tropical deforestation, in particular in Nicaragua, it is not actually a fundamental cause. We argue that the absorption of small family farms is actually caused because the economic environment in which these small farmers operate is really adverse. And this economic environment is caused by the penetration of off-farm sectors in agriculture. For example, firms supplying inputs, food retailers, and also microcredit institutions, which significantly dwarf the value added on farming, also compromising the long-term survival of the small family farms. So I am part of a bigger research group that has been exploring this issue of this problematic in Nicaragua for many decades now. And we have conducted research in 2 municipalities located in the central region of Nicaragua, Matiguas and Rio Blanco. And according to the most recent agrarian census data in this region, most of the farms are actually very small. Our farms whose sizes are lower than 10 hectares. And most of the farms can be labeled as medium-sized farms with sizes between 10 and 80 hectares, but also there is the presence of really big farms, bigger than 80 hectares. As you will expect, the prominent land use here in this region is growing pasture for cattle raising. So nearly 70% of the land in this area is used for growing pasture for cattle raising, and the rest for agriculture and other agricultural activities. So in order to understand how this structure of agricultural production has come to be, we have conducted extensive participatory research with farmers. And we have conducted research in 2 communities in Matiguas, you see here in the purple area to the left. And we have conducted also research in 3 communities in Rio Blanco that you see to the right in the purple areas that you see here. So at the methodological level, we are now focused on developing a farm-level agent-based model to understand why some small farms are better at surviving in this context than other small farms, and also how the survival of these small farms also constrain the expansion of cattle raising in the region. So far, the model, in order to represent farm-level decision-making, we combine mathematical programming and decision trees. Decision trees we use to model decisions that can have a long-term impact on the farming systems. For example, when to buy more land, when to buy more livestock, or when to even engage in deforestation. And we use mathematical programming to represent how farmers manage the resources that they already have available. Additionally, we are going to incorporate satellite images to better represent the biophysical landscape in which these farmers operate. So I want to share with you some preliminary results of this modeling exercise. So far, we have developed a model that we have named FASTLOOK, which stands for Farming Systems Transition and Land Cover Land Use Change. And the time resolution of this model is 1 month, meaning that every time advance in the model, we move forward 1 month. And the spatial resolution of the model is a 1/4 hectare, which means that every plot of land in the model has a size of 25 square meters. So far, the model is able to capture many dynamics, for example, price and production risk, and how the risk aversion behavior of farmers also have a consequence in terms of the activities they implement at the level of the farm. Also, we are able to capture some seasonal labor constraints, capital constraints, and a big question that we want to explore with the model is the role of microcredit, but this is a feature that we have yet to incorporate in the model. So here are some typical results from a typical simulation within FastLook. In the left chart, you will see these two lines are, for example, the green line is how many improved farms survive through time, and the blue line is how many traditional farms, let's call them like that, survive through time. So you can see that improved farms, in a way, are resisting the economic environment in which they stand in relation to farms that are more traditional. Also, you can see that if we analyze how cattle rising expand in terms of how many plots of pasture are used within the model, you see that cattle rising is only possible if cattle ranchers absorb these small traditional farms. It's the only way. And another very interesting result is that the small farms that survive, the ones that don't get kicked out from this region, they don't get expelled, in a way, they have to grow in size to be able to become economically viable. So this, in a way, is already explaining the polarized land tenure structure that I was talking earlier. There are very little small family farms, and there is a lot of medium and big farms. So this is already something that we can explain within the model. And also, we can see that if we incorporate more adverse ecological conditions, such as, for example, soil degradation trends, we see also that these farms are also better at surviving these ecological dynamics. So far, we are now trying to incorporate satellite imageries to better represent the landscape in which these farms operate. Here you have some land cover data from the European Commission, and then we have also elevation data and slope data to try to represent how this geographical information will also impact the way farmers engage into agricultural production, and how also the landscape constrain the way they do farming themselves. So this was my talk. Thank you very much for listening. And
any questions before we move on to the next? Yes, Ol.
Hi, thanks. What's the relationship between the different land use types, traditional, improved, cattle, and soil fertility? So are some worse for soil fertility than others?
Yes, the thing is that in the fieldwork section, we don't have like a survey, for example, of farmers, so we don't have very specific characteristics of every type of farm in the region. What we used were some in-depth case studies. So using this in-depth case story, what we did is to build a representative traditional farm and a representative improved farm. So what you see in the model is not a wide range of heterogeneous farm, but some representative farms. And the main difference is utilization of more efficient cropping techniques, for example, mixing maize with beans, for example, or implementing some chemicals to try to cope with some low fertility situation and things like that. But it's not that you have many different farms, it's just a representative traditional and a representative non-traditional farm.
Okay, great. Thanks, Elder. If there's no other questions, we will move on to our final presentation. Last but not least, Julia.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Julia. I'm a PhD student at the Helmholtz Center for Environmental Research in Leipzig, which is based in Germany in Central Europe, where in the last years we faced an increasing severity and frequency of summer droughts, which challenge farmers a lot. And that's why in my PhD I'm trying to find solutions how grassland farmers can insure against this drought risk. And I'm doing this together with my supervisors Jürgen Grönefeld and Birgit Müller. I should say greetings to everyone who knows them, and our project partner Robert Finger. And today I would like to tell you how the management adaptation of farmers, which is one option, depends on how farmers define their reference income. So if they rather see their income as being as much profit as possible, or if they maybe see their income as some expectation referring to further experiences. And when I'm talking about managing grasslands, I mean how often farmers cut and fertilize their grasslands, so they can decide to do this by 1 to 6 times per year. And from this perspective of adapting to droughts, there occurs a trade-off for farmers, which I like to show you at an example from a field experiment at our institution, where you can see in the darker green line an extensive managed grassland plot, so it's cut once a year, and a more intensively managed one, which is cut and fertilized about 3 times a year. And in the bars you see the precipitation, and in 2018 in Central Europe there was a really huge drought. And what you can see is that the extensive grassland was much more drought resistant than the intensive one plot. That's mainly based on what ecologists call the insurance hypothesis, because extensive grasslands are usually having more different plants, and so they are more resistant against droughts than more intensively managed ones. However, at the same time you see that the overall yield of these extensive grasslands is always much lower than of the intensive one. So there is a trade-off for the farmers between adopting to drought and making yield. So the question is, what should farmers do? So does it make sense for them to adopt to this drought insurance solution, so going for more extensive farming? And if we look at this example I showed you, and we would just say we want to maximize our profit, it looks not very promising. So if we would say just the more profit the better, in this case the farmer wouldn't do it, because the profit is always better for the intensive one. But there are many empirical studies asking farmers how they react to risks, and they show that farmers are averse of risks, so they prefer stable income over a variant one, and they are also happy to give up a bit of income for that. So instead of this just straight line where you have the more profit the better, the approach, which is called cumulative prospect theory, suggests to make more like an S-shaped curve, where farmers have kind of a profit where they say, okay, so this is my neutral income, which I would like, and everything above I perceive as a gain and everything below as a loss. And this concave form says that they are afraid of this variance, because if we now make an expected value between these 3 points in 3 different weather options, this is much closer to the average for the more intensive farming option than in our straight line. And so this would already be much more promising that farmers would go for the extensive one, but still it looks not too good. But what other studies also say is that actually this point of 0, where farmers say this is our neutral income, refers to our expectations. And if we go to our example, this would mean, like, well, if we have an extensively managing farmer who had over all those years this more darker green line, he would probably not expect himself to have a profit like the intense farmer. So they have less stocks, they just don't expect to have that much income. So probably they would place their reference point at a much lower profit, so more on the left, and would see their highest income with a much higher utility than the intensively managing farmer. And if we do this kind of a trick and shift this utility curve more to the left, it quite looks good for managing extensively. And if we would calculate the expected value now for both, then extensive managing would win. So you see that with adopting these behavioral rules, we can change how the farmers would insure themselves against grasslands. As this is just one example, and this probably looks different for different sites, we tried to do this a bit more systematically and build it a very stylized, small ecological economic model which assesses this, where we first put in how much yield the farmer harvests at which cost, depending on their management choice and the weather, so if we have a drought or not. And then we calculate how much profit the farmer makes for this combination of management and weather. And here we assume that the farmers feed their grass to cows and produce milk of it just to somehow monetize the harvest. And then we assume a certain probability of drought and no drought. And we put in how these gap between the utility curves looks like, so how differently they perceive their income. And then we can calculate the expected cumulative prospect value for the different management options the farmer has and look which one is the best, so which management intensity would pay off most for them. And as you can already imagine, it's not easy to, even if it's a very small and easy model, to get all of this data, and it looks very different for different farmers. We didn't just calculate it for one farm, but we tried to make a big kind of sensitivity analysis. So we produced a lot of synthetic input data and then looked on which input conditions led to which optimal management intensity. So what we varied was this gap between the reference income, so how they, or which was the 0 point they received as the neutral income. What we also varied was how these yield curves actually looked like, so how big is the gap between extensive and intensive, and how drought resistant are the different management opportunities. Then we varied the costs for the different management options by ±50% to include regional variabilities. And for the drought probability, we just tried out everything from we never have a drought to we always have a drought. And yes, we draw just kind of randomly by a Latin hypercube sample 100,000 samples from these rules, and then run our model with all of these samples and look what comes out. And what came out was this distribution. So in almost 3/4 of the samples, extensive was the best option. But as this is not based on data, we cannot directly interpret this. But what we can now do is to see which input conditions led to extensive win. And we did this by a classification or decision tree. We already heard in 2 of our talks already, which gives you some conditions on your input data to see which of them led to which output. And we see that the most important factor that led to extensive management being a good choice was this introduction of this gap in the reference income. And only if this gap was big enough, then most of the samples have that extensive was winning. Or if we have a very small gap between the yield curves and a high yield resistance of extensive one, then we also had a high share of extensive management winning. But in the other cases, intensively managing was still the option to go because it gives the most profit to the farmer. And as is this, the behavioral model session, I tried to make this even a bit more clear. So I run our 100,000 examples for the different behavioral rules I showed you before to make it more clear. So if we would go with this trade utility line and just maximize the profit, then we see that in like more than 3/4 of the cases, intensive or the second most intensive option would be the best. And if we would add risk averseness and calculate what we call expected utility so that farmers are afraid of variance, then it's a bit shaping towards extensive but not too much. And also if we introduce loss averseness, so this S-shaped curve. Then we have a bit of polarization between 1 and 3, but if we take the two more intensive ones together as one part, still 2/3 around of all of our input examples also show that they are best. And only if we introduce this gap in how they perceive their reference, only then extensive management gets the optimal one. So with this, we can make some conclusion. So the behavioral land system model we came up with was very stylized, but still we could get some outsides of it and evaluate grassland management strategies for Central Europe. And for the farmers, the main outcoming is that extensive management only pays off if they refer their income to former expectations and say, well, if I do extensive managing, I expect less profit and I'm fine with that. And only then it makes sense from their point of view, but it will not prevent them from income losses due to this more drought resistance. So from a profit-wise point of view, it will not pay off for them. So going to politicians, we could conclude from this that if we want to promote extensive grassland management, we cannot assume that farmers will do that, because from this profit point of view, it doesn't make sense for them. So we will need further incentives. And also, as it doesn't prevent income losses, we need further risk management options for them, such as formal insurances to get some insurance for their drought shocks. And from a research perspective, I think there is much research out on how exactly these curvature and utility functions looks like, but all these elicitations don't take care about this reference income. And so I don't know if this assumption is realistic or not. So we would need to have some elicitations which go this step before and ask farmers, what are you actually maximizing? Is it absolute profit or like the expectation you have from former years? And so I think this would be really important, as we see that this simple change in assumptions completely changes our results, and there's not much of empirical evidence on what farmers actually maximize. And with this, thank you so much for your attention. And if you're interested in our project, you can find our homepage and my contact details there. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Julia. Okay, don't run away. We might have a question. Because we've got 2 minutes left in the session, so we're not going to have time for a plenary discussion, but we might have time for a quick question for Julia. No? Everyone's ready for coffee? Oh, we do have one over here.
Thank you. I have a question about the reference income delta. I didn't quite understand what is which one. You have the two curves. I don't know how to interpret which one is positive and negative. What is being...
Just from acoustic-wise, it's...
Hello?
Yeah,
thank you. Okay. I have a question about the reference income.
Yes.
The delta. I don't understand which one is which. Which one is being subtracted for which. So if you... The delta of positive 2,000 per hectare, which one is being...
So...
The extensive or the...
yes, so
the two... Yeah.
The intensive minus... So the like extensive minus the intensive one, so the right minus the left. So how much bigger it is? Yeah. Okay.
Great, thanks. So we're just about out of time. This slide here is the presentation that we didn't have today. So if you want to follow up on that. We do now have a coffee break, and for the BeModeLS working group, if we want to get together over coffee, we can have